Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on managing challenging behaviors. I hope you all can see me. This is our first actual public webinar, so just be patient if we have a few kinks that we're working through. I emailed you a handout a few hours ago, which had some descriptions of different strategies that you'll want to try. They're gonna just guide you through different aspects of this webinar. So if you haven't already, just make sure that you check that email, and there's a link for the handout that you can look at while you're looking at the presentation. So we are going to get started. So just a little bit, just a second. I'm trying to click through this slide here. Okay. So just a little bit about Selected, if you don't already know. Selected is an online matching platform for teachers looking for great schools. It's absolutely free for teachers always. The way it works is you create a profile. It takes about 10 minutes. And you state your preferences. It's going to ask you a series of questions related to what type of teacher you are, what kind of school you're looking for. And schools are doing the same things on their end. And basically matches are created and schools can reach out to you first. So you get an average the first week, you get about 5 matches. And you are able to sort of, and these are all schools that are just right fit for you. So nobody's time is wasted, and you're able to research the school and apply to them, or they can reach out to you first. You also get a coach to help you with all aspects of the job search. I'm a coach. We have several others as well. We have a number of resources to help you with your job searches. We have tons of schools. We have over 1,100 at this point. We started in New York City, so a lot of them are in New York City, but we've expanded, and we have, if you're looking to relocate, or if you can commute to New Jersey, or we have a ton of schools in Boston, DC, Philly, LA, everywhere. So check it out. You'll find a ton of resources on getselected.com related, and I'll explain this at the end, related to the demo lesson. We have online courses now as well, blog articles. And again, it's always free for teachers. I highly recommend that you create a profile. I would do it myself if I were still a teacher. I wish that it was around when I was teaching. And yeah, so any questions, you could always email me at the end at liz@getselected.com. So I'm going to get into the content here. Here's our agenda for tonight. So we'll start with the introduction. I just want to mention that you might want to have, in addition to the handout, I'm guessing that you probably didn't print it out. If you did, great. If you don't, just have either a pen and paper handy, or just some way of recording some notes on your computer or your laptop so that you can respond during when I'm asking questions. So this is just the introduction. This is what we're gonna be reviewing tonight. You can just read this silently to yourself. These are our 3 objectives for the evening. All right, the first thing I want you to do is, you're obviously here. Well, there's a number of reasons you could be here. Either you're a brand new teacher and you are just knowing that classroom management might be an issue for you, as it is with most new teachers. You could be here because you're currently a teacher and you're having some issues in your classroom, which is like every other teacher in the world. Or maybe you're just interested in going into teaching and you're just looking to learn a little bit more about it. But if you fall into one of the first 2 categories, I want you to just start thinking or jotting down just what's going well in your classroom right now. It's so easy to think about what isn't going well, and that's usually what we think about at the end of the day, right? But I want you to think about what is going well. So just take a second. Let's take maybe 30 seconds to just write down some ideas that you have, some things that are going well in your classroom. So the first thing you want to remember to do, and this is going to eliminate 95% of your behavioral problems, is these 4 things. The first is that you want to remain calm and neutral. Much, much easier said than done. We totally get that. But this is really super, super important. And what I mean by that is basically that there's a difference between saying, for example, why are you arguing? to a student, you see the way my face looked, you hear my tone, why are you arguing? There's a difference between saying that and saying, why are you arguing? And this happens so many times throughout the day, and it can really affect the way that a student feels when you approach them about something that's happening. So you want to remain calm and neutral as much as possible, and I want to say at all times. The second is expectations. This is something that teachers often forget, but it's a super easy fix. So whenever you see student misbehavior, students breaking rules, or so you thought, just think to yourself, are my expectations clear? So in other words, if students are coming in and they're talking, you have to think to yourself, did I make it clear that I wanted them to be silent? A lot of times you didn't make it clear, right? And you didn't realize it. So you want to make sure that the expectations are clear and also that the expectations are communicated to the students. So they might be clear to you, but they might not be clear to the students. The third thing is you want to use the least invasive method possible when you're addressing students breaking rules. And we're going to talk a lot about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now, but basically, and it's also described in your handout if you just want to take a sneak peek if you can't wait. But it's basically strategies that are not intrusive on the student's thoughts and space. So, and you want to make these corrections to student behavior as invisible as possible to other students. And don't worry if that makes no sense to you. We are going to go into detail about it in just a second. The last thing is you want to use interactive modeling and reinforcing language as much as possible. And again, these 4 things are going to help you with 95% of their behavior problems. There is a 5%, which we will go into, but these are going to help you with 95% of behavior problems. What I mean by interactive modeling is basically when you're reminding students of what they're supposed to be doing by showing them or having a student show them. So if they come in and they're, if you want them to enter silently and go to their desk, but they're running and they're talking, you're just reminding them by actually saying, let me show you how we do this. And you walk in silently and sit at your desk. Now you try, that type of thing. There's more of a description in your handout. And then reinforcing language is very similar to positive narration. You're just stating the positive behavior. You're stating the correct behavior. So for example, saying, Michaela got her book out already. Andrew's already reading. So the students are hearing you restate the correct behavior instead of hearing you say, you didn't get your books out and you're not reading. It's just a positive way of stating the desired behavior. So we're going to go into more detail about a lot of those strategies and what they mean. Take a minute. This is a diagram of the less invasive techniques that you could be using. Take a minute. This is also in your handout to just look this over. And when you're done looking it over, you can also I would take just 3 full minutes to look through the handout that I sent you. It describes each one of these techniques in detail. And it's going to describe what it looks like in the classroom and when you should use each one. So just take 3 minutes, look over the techniques that you see here, and also read through your handout. Okay, we are back. So hopefully you all had a chance to read through some of the techniques. And what you may have noticed is that all the way to the left, this is when we're taught, these are strategies that you use for whole group and group corrections. So in other words, the farther to the right you go, the more likely it is to be an individual correction or an individual that's breaking the rule. And also the farther to the right we go, the more invasive generally the correction is. And this is important to note because generally teachers, including myself when I was a teacher, the instinct is to go straight for that correction, that public correction, right? Michael, put your books away. But this diagram is basically showing you is there are a number of other strategies that you can use that are much less invasive, that are just as effective. The only way that you should be using individual corrections is if you've exhausted all of the other less invasive strategies, right? So, and we want these things to be as anonymous as possible in any given situation. So now we're gonna do an activity. I'm gonna give you some scenarios, and you are gonna choose which strategy you would use based on what you just read and based on what you're seeing here. So here, in scenario number 1, we have a student whispering to another student, and it appears that they are trying to make them laugh. This happens 14 times a day, probably, right? So which strategy would you use? A student is whispering to another student, it appears that they are trying to make them laugh. Instinct might be just to go for the straight correction, right? Michaela, what's happening? Stop making her laugh. What are you guys laughing about? What's the least invasive strategy that you could use? Just take a second and think about it. Okay, if you chose proximity, that would be ding, ding, ding. That would be the #1 strategy that you could use. And by proximity, what we mean is you just continue teaching, continue doing exactly what you're doing. Don't draw any attention to the situation, and you just walk over and stand near the students. I want to say 90% of the time, the behavior is going to stop. Done, end of story, continue teaching. If the behavior continues, then we can move on to more invasive strategies, which we'll talk about. So next scenario. Scenario number 2, students have been told to enter the classroom silently and begin the do now. Instead, the majority enter chatting, do not sit down, or begin their work. This has probably happened in your classroom if you have a do now. This happens in classrooms all across the world, probably. And there is a less invasive strategy that you can use. What is it? So take a second and just think about what that is. Okay, because this is a number of students and not just a few students, you're going to use a strategy like either a whole group reminder of what the expectations are, or interactive modeling, which we talked about. You could also use, if you feel like they just need a little bit of, if they know, and this is just, they're just chatty that day for whatever reason. If they've been through this a million times, they don't need it to be modeled over and over again. They just need a reminder. You can just use reinforcing language. So for example, saying, great, I saw 10 people come in and get started right away. Good, I see now a couple more of you have gotten started. Just a reminder, you're working on the do now. Something to that nature, to that effect. Okay, the next scenario, scenario number 3. So this is when you've used proximity, you have used the teacher look, and you've also used a silent signal to redirect a student who has had their cell phone out. Another very, very, very common problem. They respond by rolling their eyes. The dreaded eye roll sends chills up my spine. They roll their eyes and they say, I'm looking something up for school. What do you do? So take a minute and think about that. So if you guessed private conversation and consequence, you are correct. It looks like they've exhausted all the other strategies. You've tried 3 different less invasive strategies and none of them worked. You need to have a conversation with them. However, and we're going to talk about this in the next section, that conversation probably shouldn't happen right at that moment. And we will talk about why, but I'm guessing that your wheels are already turning about why. Generally, this is, if you're in the middle of instruction, it's not a good time to have a conversation with a student about their behavior unless there's a safety issue. Why? Because you have teaching to do, right? So you can just say something to them like, we'll talk about this in a second, and then continue teaching, neutral, don't appear to be annoyed about the situation, just keep going about your business. Okay, next up, the why. So now we're gonna go into the 5%. So most of those behavior problems in your classroom can be eliminated by using those less invasive strategies, I promise you. But when those strategies do not work, what do we do? The first thing we want to do is explore the why. So it's happening for a reason. Why are these students continuing to not follow directions, even when you're giving them constant reminders? Let's explore that a little bit. Okay, so what I want you to do is, hopefully you are teaching or you're in a teaching program, so you have, you're with students every day and you can think of a scenario in your head. But you want to think about a student that in your classroom that you've worked with that is recently engaged in rule-breaking behavior. And especially if this is a situation that was really frustrating for you. Because we're going to go ahead and go back and just work through that, the why behind it, and then think about what could have been done differently. So we'll take 1 minute, and this is in your handout, but if you don't have the handout, you just want to, the first thing you want to do is describe the student's behavior, so exactly what they did, and be as subjective as possible. So just describe everything that happened. I said this, he did this. I said this, she did this. Then the second thing you want to do is describe the ideal behavior. So I gave you examples here on the slide, but an example is, like, I asked the student to sit, all the other students were sitting, they said no, they walked over to sharpen a pencil, I walked over to them, I said just go sit down, they didn't sit down. That's an example of what happened, the problematic behavior. Then you want to state the ideal behavior. So I asked the student to sit, the student sat down. So let's do 1.5 minutes to just do those two things, and I'll see, let's do 2 minutes actually, and just write down the ideal behavior and the student's problematic behavior. Okay, we are back. So now that you have described the rule-breaking behavior in your classroom that we're going to get into a little bit more, we are going to get into this incredibly complicated map that I created. I know it looks a little scary, but I'm going to walk you through it. It's very, very helpful. Trust me. So the first thing you want to do is, whenever there is a rule-breaking behavior of any kind in your class, the first thing, so you see the little start here, the green arrow, start there. Think about the rule-breaking behavior. First thing you want to ask yourself is, are the expectations clear to the students? Do the students know what they should be doing, and is that clear? A lot of times, it's actually not. You'd be surprised. So if the expectations aren't clear, so I'll give you an example, and I'll walk you through with an example. So every day, this is actually a real problem in my classroom from years ago when I was teaching. So every year, let's call him Christopher. So every day during writing time, it's time to go back to your seats and start working. Christopher goes back to his seat and does not start writing. He sits there and he pouts and he puts his head down and he's not writing. Everybody else is writing. Christopher is not writing. So that's rule-breaking behavior, right? First question, are the expectations clear? In this case, yes, they are. Every single day the students go back and write. I have the assignment posted, right? The expectations are clear. So we'll go to the next question. The next question is the problem a lack of skill or a lack of will? And this is not always easy to answer, to be completely honest. Sometimes you actually need to do a little bit of research to figure this out. So let's go both ways. If this problem was a lack of will, let's just say that Christopher can do the work and he chooses not to. And I am very well aware, because I've seen his writing samples, I've seen his writing assessments, I know he can do the work, okay? So let's just say he's not. The next thing you wanna do is you wanna ask yourself, are there consequences for the behavior? And you're just follow along the chart with my eyes. I hope you're doing that. Just follow the arrows. So the next question is, are there consequences for that behavior? So in this case, let's just say, yes, there are consequences for the behavior. And the consequence is that I go over and I work with Christopher and I help him with his work. That's what I consider the consequence. Now let's explore that a little bit. The next question is, think about why they're engaging in the rule-breaking behavior despite the consequences. Now, if you're thinking like I'm thinking now as a seasoned teacher, you're realizing that maybe that's not, in fact, a consequence for him at all, that he actually enjoys that. So he likes the idea that he can go back to his seat and he can get one-on-one support from a teacher. And he gets a teacher all to himself. So maybe he enjoys that consequence. So then you go to the next step, which is change the consequence. So if there is a consequence in place and the student is still exhibiting the behavior, then you need to change the consequence, right? So let's go the other way. And by the way, if there wasn't a consequence, if he just went back to his seat and didn't do his writing and I never addressed it, then what needs to happen? You need to address, right? You need to create a consequence. So let's go the other way. So let's just go all the way back to the beginning. Are the expectations clear? Yes. Is the problem a lack of skill or a lack of will? Let's say that it's a lack of skill. So I look at his writing samples and I look at what he can do. He can't do the work independently. He cannot do it. And that's why he's going back to his seat and he's putting his head down, he's pouting, he's frustrated, he doesn't know how to do this work on his own. You're gonna have a completely different strategy, right? Consequences are not gonna work for this child. If you hold him after school or you hold him during lunch and you make him do his writing, he still can't do it. So consequences are not gonna work. So let's go to the other side. If it's a lack of skill, it's because they currently can't independently exhibit the desired behavior, which is in this case writing. You need to teach them, obviously. If it's a simple skill, like they're running in the hallway, right? Then that's just something that you can remind them of, or you can maybe model for them if they're younger. If it's a complicated skill, like in this case, writing independently, it's gonna be a little bit trickier, right? You have to break the ideal behavior into segments. You have to pull them for small groups. You just have to come up with a plan to scaffold. And you also need to enlist their help. You need to talk to them about it. This is what we're doing, Christopher. I'm gonna work with you every day just for 5 minutes, and then I wanna see you go back on your own. I wanna see you write 4 sentences by yourself. In other words, come up with a plan. The bottom line is, the 2 things, if you take nothing else away from this, is that the first thing you wanna make sure is, are the expectations clear? Then you wanna decide if it's a matter of skill or will. If you can do both of those things, then you're gonna be in pretty good shape, okay? So what I want you to do is think about the rule-breaking behavior that you just wrote down for the previous slide, and I want you to follow this map with that particular instance. So let's just take a minute and just go through the map doing exactly what I just did, but with your particular student or the issue that's happening in your class. All right, so hopefully you were able to figure out next steps for the problem that you're having in your classroom based on this. At the very least, just deciding whether the expectations are clear and whether the problem is a lack of skill or will. It can also, in some circumstances, it can be a little bit of both, just not as common, to be honest. So we're gonna get into solving the problem and the one-on-one conversation that you have with a student when you have exhausted all of the less invasive strategies and you need to solve the problem with the student and have a one-on-one conversation. There is an art to it, believe it or not. So this is where it lies on our a diagram of less invasive techniques. As you will see, this is actually the most invasive of the strategies for obvious reasons. It's one teacher talking to one student about their behavior. Okay, when we are solving the problem, this is what the conversation can look like. Or these are the things that you should consider. Number 1, if more than one student is involved, so if there was an argument or 2 students are disagreeing about something or there's a bullying situation, all those parties need to be involved. My recommendation is that you talk to them individually first. Wait until there is a lull. Now, what is the lull? The lull is when the student is in a state of mind where they can have a conversation about their behavior. And if you're wondering why that's important, just think about a time when you were really, really upset about something. And maybe you were talking with your partner or your friend or your mom, and maybe you did something that made somebody else upset. Or maybe you're just upset about something and you're talking to them and the person is trying to give you advice or trying to tell you what you did wrong or what you need to do in the future, and you're extremely upset. Do you want to hear advice? Probably not, right? You just kind of want somebody to listen. You kind of need validation at that point. If you're the teacher, you don't need to talk to them when they're that upset. You can just give them a minute to cool off and just wait until it's in a more appropriate time. The conversation, this is another thing, the conversation should happen at a time that is actually convenient for you, not for the student. So if you're in the middle of teaching, or you're leading a small group, or you're walking around and you're coaching students or taking notes on their work, that's not the time for you to have the conversation with a student. Why? Because you have work to do, right? What you're doing is important and it needs to wait until it's a good time for you. You want to, when you have that conversation with the student, you want to listen as much as possible, and you're trying to get information from them. And you're doing this is easy to forget, because I think as teachers and just, as parents, as friends, what our instinct is really to give advice and to tell somebody what they're doing wrong and how they can fix it, but they're most likely not listening to you. What they want to do is they want to be heard, at least in the beginning. So you want to just listen, get information, gain trust from them so that they feel like they matter. Then you can talk to them. It's super, super, super important. I can't stress this enough, that you're calm and neutral when you're talking to them. Even if they just did something terrible, you want to be calm and neutral. Why? Because they're much more likely to be honest with you if you're calm and neutral. If you're clearly annoyed with the student or frustrated with the student, they're going to react. The information that they give you is going to be much different. It's going to be skewed because of that, because they're trying to prove that they're not at fault, right? Also, when you are talking about what happened, you want to just make sure that you describe the behavior and not the child. So you're talking as being as neutral as possible, as objective as possible, and you're talking about what happened, what you saw, what you're hearing, and not what you feel, okay? Again, much easier said than done. The other thing you want to do, this is probably the hardest part, is you want to validate their feelings, even if you disagree with their feelings. I mean, I want to say that you can't really disagree with somebody's feelings, but we definitely feel like that, right? When we're upset with a student, but you want to validate their feelings. I understand. So you're upset. So it sounds like you're frustrated. So it seems like you tried a lot of strategies to get him to listen to you, and you got frustrated. Just repeat back sort of what they're feeling and what they're saying. And the validation is super important so that they feel like they matter. It's also just really empowering. So those are the basics of the conversation. Okay, these are just some guidelines for when you're having a one-on-one conversation with a student. There are two different scenarios that you might have a conversation with a student about. One is if there's an incident. So something just happened and it needs to be addressed. And this is when it's usually a one-time incident, not a recurring problem. So examples might be if a student cheated on a test, or if a student hit another student or called another student a name, or if they talk back to you, things like that, just not recurring problems. And then we'll talk about recurring problems in a second. So a great way to open is to say, are you okay? Or what just happened, depending on the situation. You want to listen to them when they're answering your question. You want to listen. Don't interrupt, even if they're lying, which they might. and you've seen it, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're hearing them tell the story and you're like, that is not what I saw. And that's gonna happen, but you're not gonna say it. Just listen, just give it a minute. You wanna validate their feelings. You wanna tell them how you understand how they feel and what happened. You wanna talk about why the behavior is a problem. So, okay, I understand. So you called Marcus a name. So all right, so you called Marcus a name. That is a problem because we want to be nice to our friends. And now Marcus is upset, right? Then the last thing you want to do is either give them a logical consequence, or better, give them a choice for a logical consequence. So it seems like Marcus is really upset right now. What do you think you could do to make him feel better? Do you have any ideas? If they don't have any ideas, then you can give them some ideas. Maybe you could write them a letter. Maybe you could just apologize. What do you think? You could do this or you could do that. And just enlist their help. That way, when they are trying to fix the problem, it's much more genuine because it came from them. Now, if it's a recurring problem, just a little bit different, a lot of it's the same. You can start out the conversation by saying what you notice. So I've noticed that you've been going to the bathroom a lot and you're gone for really long periods of time. Have you noticed that? Okay, so tell me about that. What's happening? So you're starting the conversation off by saying what you notice, and then you can talk about why it's a problem. So the problem is that you're gone for 10 minutes of every class and you're missing a lot of work, and I'm seeing that reflected in your grades. So let's talk about that. Any ideas on how we can fix this? And I guarantee you they will have some ideas on how to fix it. And it's gonna be much more powerful because it comes from them and not you. And again, did you see my tone is very neutral? I'm not angry in any way. It's just a conversation between two people. You can start open-ended and then prompt if necessary. So if they don't come up with a solution, if they say like, yeah, no, I don't know. Like I need to go to the bathroom and I have to, that's what I do. I have to be gone for 10 minutes and I'm in there doing my business. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. You could say, give them some solutions. So what about if we do this? What about if we do that? Do you think that would work? And then finally, you want to just write out the solution or just say the solution and shake on it. More likely the latter rather than the former, just because of time constraints. But yeah, they're both very, very similar. The similar things are that you are going to validate, you're going to listen, you're going to enlist the student to come up with a solution. All right, so now we're going to do an activity. You can choose, these are two different scenarios. One of them is an incident and one of them is a recurring problem. What you want to do is you want to choose one of the scenarios and just write out the conversation that you would have with the student. And if you want to look at the prompts that I just gave you on the previous slide, they should be in your handout. So keeping in mind what we just talked about, you want to write out the conversation that you would have with the student and choose one of these scenarios. And I'll give you 2 minutes. We're going to go into logical consequences, and this is the last portion of the webinar. Logical consequences. If you have not used them, I highly suggest that it will change everything about your teaching. So logical, here are the basics. A logical consequence is a consequence that's tied to the student behavior. So it helps them to take responsibility for their actions. So all of the consequences that we just talked about are logical consequences. They're tied to the behavior in the one-on-one conversations that we talked about. And I'm going to give you a ton more examples. So here is a non-example. And you've probably done this before. Your parents have done this before. You've experienced this when you were a student. I definitely have. But an example of this would be, so the student is rude to their friends. The consequence is they can't go on a field trip. Do you see how those two behaviors are not at all connected to each other? Why would a student not be able to go on a field trip? Because they were rude to their friends. They're not really connected. So an example of a logical consequence would be a student is caught cheating on a test. So now the consequence is they have to sit at a table alone next time. And the reason that's a logical consequence and not a punishment like the first one is that it's tied to the behavior. It makes sense. So they're going to understand that now they're not allowed to sit next to another student because the teacher is worried that they're going to cheat. So when they're sitting alone at that table, they're going to be thinking about that behavior. They're going to be thinking about how they're not given that privilege. And they're much more likely next time to not cheat. And that's the argument here. And I'm going to give you a bunch of other examples. Again, I know this is a recurring theme. I know that I've talked about this and over and over and over again, but it's super important that you're neutral. Consequences are not about payback. Whether or not you're frustrated with the student and you're like, and I know the feeling, I completely relate when you're super, like, you're just so fed up with a child that's breaking the rules, and you know that they're better and you just want to help them, and you've seen this over and over and over again, right? But it's not about payback. You're not trying to make the student's life miserable. You're not trying to see them suffer. You're trying to get them to change their behavior. And the way that you get them to change their behavior is through logical consequences. So be as neutral as possible. It's not about you. And then just like with the one-to-one conversation, you want to enlist the student's help. So you can just talk to them and just have a conversation that addresses and enlists their help, asking how we can fix the problem. Do they have any ideas about how we can fix whatever problem they just caused? And most of the time, they do actually have ideas of how they can fix the problem. You break it, you fix it, is basically the rule. So if you hurt somebody's feelings, if you destroyed school property, if you were disrespectful to somebody, or you cheated on a test, the basic gist of it is that you are in charge of fixing the problem, and I will help you fix the problem. Super powerful. I know I've talked about this already, but just to provide a choice. If they're struggling to come up with a consequence on their own, simple, just provide a choice. Either you could do this or you could do this. So either you could, let's see. So if a student is rude to another student, you could say, all right, and they don't have any ideas of how they could fix the problem. You could say something like, either you could talk to the student until they feel better. I don't like to say apologize because it just always seems forced. So either you could talk to the student and make them feel better, or you can write them a letter. Which one would you rather do? Or you could say, like, you could do something nice to them, or you could talk to them. You could do something nice for them, or you could talk to them. So you're just providing some sort of a choice. It just makes them feel empowered, and they're just much more likely to fix the problem. All right, so here are some examples. Problem behaviors, and then what would be a logical consequence for that problem behavior. All right, and these are also really, really common. A group is off task, probably happens every day in your classroom, right? A group is off task and does not finish their work. Maybe a punishment would be to say, to have a conversation with them after class, or to take away a privilege that's not related to that. A logical consequence would be ask the students when they can make up the work by the end of the day, or ask the students to make up the work for homework. That's a logical consequence. Another problem behavior. A student cheats during a game and everybody gets upset. If you teach lower grades, maybe even upper grades, this probably happens every single time you play a game. And you're all frustrated because you're like, I was trying, you wanted to make it fun for the students, and then here's everybody's all angry and upset because this one student. A logical consequence would be the student leaves the game until they can play by the rules. And if you give them a few minutes to just set themselves away from it, they're watching everybody play the game. They want to play that game. So they're going to show you and prove to you that they can get back to that game so that they can play with their friends. A student asks you for help in a rude manner. So this has happened to me a number of times. It's incredibly frustrating. You just tell the student that you don't help students when they speak rudely to you. Just walk away. Most of the time, they're gonna change their tone completely, and then all of a sudden it's like, Miss Willingham, can I ask you something? It's a quick fix right there. They want your help, and now they know how to get it. A student keeps looking at another student's paper during work time. super common. So then you give them a choice. Stop looking at the student's paper, or you can move to another table. Most of the time, they're going to say that they're going to stop looking, and most of the time that they will stop looking, and they feel empowered because you gave them that choice. So that's logical consequences. And our time is looking good. Usually I go over, so I'm very, very proud of myself. But it's 7:58. We have 2 more minutes. I just wanted to show you some additional resources that we have. And then we have a course online. Right now we have one. We're going to have several others in the upcoming months on acing the demo. We have resources for your demo, sample lesson plans that you can use for your demo if you want, or you can modify them. And then we have actually a video of a demo lesson that you can watch from start to finish, and then just a course to walk you through it. And then finally, our blog. We have lots and lots of articles related to classroom management, related to interview, resume, hiring seasons, demo lesson, just so many different topics that you're going to find super helpful. So recommend that you visit our site, sign up for Selected, and come back for our next webinar. And that's it. So I hope you all had fun. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good night.